So for this next section, it's my pleasure to introduce Major General John Howard from the New Zealand Army. He became DIA's second Deputy Director for Commonwealth Integration on January 20th, 2018, and throughout his career, he's deployed on a number of multinational training exercises and exchanges in a wide range of tactical environments with most allied nations. Following his time in the U.S. Army War College, General Howard served as the Senior National Officer to U.S. Central Command Headquarters here in Tampa, where he worked in the J5 branch. General Howard then commanded the HQ Deployable Joint Interagency Task Force as a deployable combatant commander. And prior to becoming the DDCI here at DIA, General Howard served as the New Zealand Chief of Defense Intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major General John Howard.
Thanks, Matt. Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, hello. Some of you have heard me talk before. I will try not to talk about rugby as much as I normally do. I do know that there are some non-Americans in the audience. I can see a Scotsman waving his hand down the back saying, perhaps we should talk about rugby. So my job, working for the director at DIA, is to respectfully challenge the status quo, and I've been doing that for 18 months. I may not have been as respectful as I probably should, because there are some cultural issues to talk to you about. I'm not going to stand behind the lectern. I will use the language of US Army, i.e. PowerPoint. But having worked for a few Marines, I know that PowerPoint is not the most effective tool to communicate. And I know that I don't speak your language all the time. So I have Major Whitesall there. Put your hand up, Seamus. He's my Babel fish. For those of you that are familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he will interpret if I go off on a tangent or I don't say the words that are right. First slide, please. So I want to talk to you about getting to yes fire. And already the director and Jack and Doug talked about the importance of partnership. I'm going to go through some slides pretty quickly. But coalition warfare is not new. Hannibal led a coalition. He used emerging technology. He put leather on elephants and rode it over the hills. Coalitions are part of what we all do. I tend to think about it as a family thing. It's important to me for a couple of reasons, because when I get out of bed in the morning and I drive across the river to DIA, I ask myself, why am I here? Some of that lays on General Stewart's shoulders, because we had a discussion about why I needed to be here, and some with General Ashley. I'm here because I need to be here. I need to be here because of my own experiences over the 30-odd years, but more importantly, I've really got to be here for the next operation to set the conditions for success, what I call the coalition after next. And why do I need to have that discussion? Contrary to some people that I've spoken to, and I'm talking about Americans, and I'm not here to offend anybody, but there may be some passion that comes out. My family first deployed into the Middle East in October 1915, and every generation since then has dismounted for operations in what we once called Mesopotamia. 5 generations, and a 6th generation is now preparing to deploy in a coalition. This should not come as a surprise, yet we still struggle with the concept of how do we create strategic deterrence, how do we create coalition effects. The world is not flat. Doug has already told us that. It's a little hard when you live at the bottom of the world, as I do, poised like a dagger over the heart of Antarctica. We deal with penguins, there's a few orcs. Now and again, a couple of hobbits get out of control and someone loses their lunch. Sometimes it's really hard to see what the threat is when you are so isolated. But my career has meant that every year that I've been in uniform, I have gone overseas. Every year since 1984, I've either been on a plane, deployed in a training team or advisory capacity. It gets a little scary and a little tiring if every time you turn up, the door is shut. Oh, we don't know who you are, we don't know how to trust you, we don't know what to do. For most of us, when we deploy, we're a little bit like Texas Rangers. You get one of us per fight, it's normally the same one of us. It's a little bit different in a big organisation where you're not used to seeing us. Next slide, please. So what does good look like? What do I think we need to move forward with integration? It's about access to support decision makers. It's not a one-way discussion. Next slide, please. And it's really hard. Now, I've borrowed the words from recently retired Lieutenant General Nagata, who spoke recently at a seminar I was at, and he talked about how hard integration is. The reason we haven't got it right is it is hard. It's really hard if you're uncomfortable, if you don't understand and you can't trust or you don't know how to trust. We still need to have liaison, we still need to cooperate, we still need to be interoperable. Next slide, please. And you've got to have a reason why. Opening slides from Jack put up the National Defence Strategy for the US. It's a very good strategy, it's very clear, it's your strategy. We, non-Americans, can help you with all of those things. Especially the efficiency part, which really does my head in. Sometimes we think we hide behind size. When there's only 16,000 of us in a defence force, things are easy. They're not. It's about the culture, it's about the policy and the risk. Next slide, please. Of course, it's about trust. Now, how do we build trust? It's really hard. So I'm a graduate of the US Army War College. There's a few other graduates here. Got to be. I know there's a couple here. Good, right. So I failed my first written assignment at the Army War College. Hopefully my professor's not here. Good. I can't see him. Why did I fail my first written assignment? Because I used the wrong spell check. I used Queen's English, not American English. So I had several punctuation errors in that first assignment, and the marking guide said more than 12, you get a big F. And I didn't quite understand that because I'm not used to policies that deny me the ability to succeed. So I went to the professor and he said, the policy guide says this is the rule. So I questioned his parentage and went out of the room and went and found the commandant. So I went, and I don't think Greg's here either, he was a 2-star, I was a lieutenant colonel. When he welcomed us in, he said, if you have a problem, come and see me. So I had a problem. So I went straight past his protocol office and his executive staff and said, your Professor X has a parentage problem. And he said, that's okay, John, we'll see how we build trust and how we make this work. And the policy answer was I had to go and do English comprehension training in the library. Of course, I didn't go and do the English comprehension training. I went to a bar called Alibis, where I questioned the parentage of the person that wrote the policy. Because someone couldn't understand that I'd already had some education and done something that allowed me to write. And because I put my U's and Z's or Z's in the wrong place, we had no progress was made. I got there in the end, I graduated, and I learnt to change my spell check. I still struggle every time I go into the building at work. I don't know if you've been into DIA headquarters. Excellence and defence of the nation. It's just spelt wrong. It's the right message, but it's just spelt wrong. And the really important part of that is it's excellence and defence of our nations. You do not fight alone. I have not fought alone. You, America, have recovered my dead and wounded on more than one battlefield. And I am eternally grateful for that. I lost soldiers in Afghanistan and they were flown home in 24 hours to the other side of the world. That's trust. And that doesn't happen without someone making a really strategic decision. But you've got to be able to build trust. And in this domain, we've got to be able to trust data. Slide. Now, the director's already stolen a couple of my themes here, but I'm going to reinforce them. I like this quote from Eisenhower. I used it in some work at the War College. Have a look at the strategic leadership at the table there. Eisenhower's headquarters had less than 300 people in it. It was stood up without Eisenhower. It would mean today standing up a combatant command without the commander to do a very complex operation. And there was no trust between the nations that were in that headquarters because they just didn't know each other. They hadn't been to school, they hadn't been on other conflicts, and they were forced together to do something really that they didn't want to do. Next slide. Of course, it's easier for the Commonwealth. I like this picture because it does talk to who we are. We have authorities that would scare most of the lawyers in the room. It will scare you because we in New Zealand and the UK have no written constitution. It's a really interesting discussion when you start talking about legal authorities to touch data, to shift data, to own it. But it's really important if you understand what opportunities your coalition partners bring. And having what we call the Queen's Commission makes it even easier because we are instantly recognisable when we go into a coalition conflict. Next slide. Now, the director's already talked about this. This is a picture of the American code breakers breaking Japanese code. Next slide. And here's a 3-rotor Enigma machine, the German technology that was then broken. Next slide. And this is the person that was using it or thought they were using it. This is Major General Bernard Freiberg. He's the commander on Crete. This picture is taken on the 20th of May, 1941. Contrary to some education, the war started a little bit earlier for some people. In fact, it started that early in my country that we declared war on Germany 12 hours ahead of the rest of the world, because someone in the headquarters didn't have their time clock set and forgot to tell the Prime Minister that we just declared war on Nazi Germany 12 hours before everybody else. There was a policy mistake, there was a not understanding technology issue, and it was this belief that we'll go where we're told to go. So here's Freiberg. This picture's taken. His aide on the left is killed just after this picture is taken. Why Freiberg looks so worried is in the next picture. There was the airborne invasion into Crete. The New Zealand division and the Australians and the Brits that landed there were pushed off Greece, and they landed here, and the Enigma code, whilst it was given to certain people, was still bound by policy and policy interpretation. And the understanding that the message about where the German airborne invasion would come was still shrouded around, we don't want to disclose the source. So when Freiberg was getting his daily read, what he got was a piece of information that says it's possible that an airborne assault may occur, as opposed to, with extreme confidence, we know what they're doing, when they're doing it, and how they're doing it. And that led the naval commander to put in a blockade at the wrong place at the wrong time. Policy, as well as the culture, shifted the outcome. It was not a good outcome. So, if you're going to breathe life into a coalition, you've got to give it CPR. Personal view after my career to date. Culture is the thing that drives it all. Policy is really important, and we've already heard people talk about risk. Next slide. We're all very used to culture. If we look around this room, we'll see service culture, national culture, different accents from different parts of the country. Sometimes we're not good at looking internal and saying, what is our culture? I tend to have this discussion at DIA, and I talk about families. Just about everybody has a family experience. Most of you this summer have probably been to a family barbecue. Most of you, when you were younger, probably had a sibling that pushed you to the ground. Probably. Most of you probably were told, get in the car, we're going to the family barbecue, and you will eat what Auntie Martha is cooking, and you will like it. And you will talk to your cousins and play with them. And you got used to that. And probably at that same barbecue, one of the uncles had a little bit too much to drink, and someone probably brought along a guest that was not culturally appropriate. But that's what families do. That's what coalitions do. If you don't understand who you're working with, you've got a real challenge. It's going to be even more complex when we think about what is the culture in the information age when you may not have a physical meeting. Next slide. Now, I work inside DIA, I deal with policy each and every day. Some of you here work with me on that challenge. Some of you hear me talk again and again about policy. Who owns it? Who has the authority to waiver it? Who has the authority to change it? How do we lift policy to enable strategy? It's not easy. I know it's not easy. Next slide. The challenge, of course, is risk, and we've had people talk about risk already today. Ownership of risk is very hard if you don't understand what the mission is, what the strategy should be, and how do you lift what you need to do from a military effects point of view. But we've also got to have the discussion of what is the risk of not integrating? What is the risk of not sharing? What is the risk of not enabling the technology to be used in a different manner if one of your partners has found another way of using what you've got? Or they've modified it and they haven't told you. Next slide. We cannot approach risk like this. If we force it down to the individual, we impose what Clausewitz would say is friction on our decision making. We've got to elevate it to risk of strategy. Next slide. And why? Again, why? Why is more important. This is what we look like today. These are 5th generation platforms. The P8 is a data integrated system, and the US Navy has 111 of them, and 48 are owned by 9 other countries. Have a think about that from a capacity point of view, and that's just the P-8, let alone the F-35. And think about, what does it mean in the coalition after next, where we find ourselves with data? How do we trust it? How do we move it? What does it mean to the decision maker? And then what does it mean when we're building these platforms for the acquisition decision? Well, we can't share that. It becomes real challenging really quickly, and that's only 5th generation. The P-8 will be upgraded in 18 months, and each of those other 9 nations will be upgrading and modifying capabilities in their national interest. And if we think about it from an acquisition point of view, that's going to become really complex for those that we need to support. Next slide. So how do we feed that into an operating model? Currently, we've got some very rigid operating models that are probably dated at best. How do we think about 5th generation information sharing? What are our structures? We're by my grandfather, who dismounted in a similar uniform in the Middle East 100 years ago. Is that the right structure for what we need to do? Now, I am not saying remove the regimental structure, remove all that we hold dear, but we need to think really hard about what does it mean. Okay. And the workforce, we had a question from the floor on the workforce. I would challenge you that the 5th generation workforce is yet to present itself to support the 5th generation platforms that we are now delivering into our military environments, and that the workforce is not bound by CONUS. If we've got platforms that are shareable, why is the workforce not transferable at speed? Where do you find the best workforce to enable the mission? And if it stays in a stovepipe, we're not going to be creating the strategic opportunities that we need to hold threat at risk. Next slide. And then what does that mean for the 6th generation? Because the workforce is not going to chunk and block acquisition to deliver what we need to do. Next slide. This is a personal view. This is what I call the traits of a 7th generation data warrior. I think we need to reflect for a moment on why we do things. So I started life as a rifleman. Rifleman's a wonderful name. I was very proud of being a rifleman and being an infantryman, but the name has connotations to what the job is. Wellington created rifle regiments using technology. By putting rifling in barrels, he was able to disperse his ranks but still concentrate fire. Rifleman. Do we still need to have that if you're a data warrior? How do you shift effects from subsurface to surface to air in an environment where we're still using very old names? And sometimes we're not good at letting go of those names. Sometimes we get anchored in the colour of our beret, our badges and our belts. I've got a wonderful book that I reflect back on often, and it was an argument afloat in General Freiberg's headquarters. He's going to the Middle East, they're on a ship, they've left New Zealand, it's 1939, and all the officers are having an argument about what hat they should be wearing when they get there. And there are people declaring the war would be lost if we don't wear the right hat. Now, I'm old-fashioned, I probably wanted to wear a steel hat or a Kevlar hat. But we had people that were reflecting that the mounted rifle hat that we wear, made of felt, must be worn in combat, because that's what they wore in World War I. It's the culture that defines it. And anybody that's been shot at will know that you don't want to wear a felt hat. I'd really value feedback on this concept of a 7th generation data warrior, because I'm not sure that we've got that agile in our thinking yet. And then the challenge is understanding the network. So this is some work that we've started in the 18 months that I've had the pleasure of working in DIA, mapping and understanding who we are, because the stovepipes that exist are huge. And sometimes we don't know what other agencies and entities are doing, let alone what's happening at task groups and task forces, nor do we understand what the opportunities are from perhaps where a partner may view things in the world. And sometimes we don't even want to go and talk to them, because we are not enabled by policy or culture to drive into that discussion. If we can understand our own network better, we will be able to be more agile. And I'll end with a quote from General Mattis, which won't come as a surprise to those of you in this room who've worked with him. So fundamentally, I'm here to do one thing inside DIA. It is to shift the discussion from a bound around policy to what does the operating model for integration for the future look like. It's not a discussion about turning on red lights or turning off red lights. It's not a discussion around you can't see or I can't talk to you. How do we integrate for a 5th generation going to a 6th generation so that my next generation doesn't have to buy desert boots again? Now, I'm happy to take questions, happy to be challenged. We should have a robust discussion. Happy to talk about rugby. Happy to talk about cricket even, tragic as it was.
Sir, what are your thoughts on the early stages of development and working together on systems and shifting to the left from now kind of implementing systems and throwing them over the fence to production?
Yep. Okay, so not here as a New Zealander, not here as an American, even though I've got a badge and I'm dressed as a Kiwi. So I'm not making a policy statement. What I'd suggest to you, if we don't build it from the ground up, we are going to miss the opportunities not only to move quickly, but we'll miss the diversity of analytical thought and engineering thought that goes into the production of a capability that will enable coalition effects. The more we stay in stovepipes, the harder it is. When you get thrown a new capability, you know, I've been deployed and someone said, here, capability, there it is. You've got to stop, pause and retrain yourself. And you've got to use American manuals, which for Kiwis is really hard because you've got to try and read them, let alone thinking other than Kiwi or Australian, because we all speak differently. How do we work in a broader coalition? Because we should be thinking about mission. Coalition should land on a mission, do what it needs to do and evaporate. The other thing I'd really be happy to see is that from an IT point of view, that systems are not down, bolted to the ground for the rest of our lives. Land on a mission and evaporate, and allow technology to pulse where the warfighter needs to be. How's that for a non-political party view? Still didn't talk about rugby.
In regards to the security clearance, it's a big issue with coalition passing of clearances via cable to the U.S. I've always thought it would make great sense on an integration spectrum to have coalition clearances certified into a common database where the U.S. and the coalition can interchange and have that instead of having to have manual cable sent. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yep. That's a really good question. Some of the people that are sitting a bit closer to the front here, we have a meeting about this regularly. We come back to the concept of trust. How do you know that you can trust someone when you can't see their clearance? How do you find the right pathway? I tend to talk about it like your driver's license. So in my bag over there is my Virginia's driver's license. You know, I live in Virginia. How do you know that I can drive a car? You don't. But you make a bold assumption that the DMV did something before they gave me the license. Clearances need to be at the same way. Somehow the process to clear how we've been vetted and what we do needs to be a lot more agile. It's really hard. It's hard enough across the USIC, let alone in a coalition environment. It's really challenging when you build a coalition. I've been at the forefront of a coalition that was built around an operation in East Timor, and generally what was happening is we were landing and doing things, and the coalition arrived. We tended to take people at face value until they proved otherwise. That's okay if you're not in the high end of the business. I wish I had an easy answer for you because it's a US policy discussion that some of my colleagues here at the front probably have a better insight. We work it regularly. All right, so this is probably the point in the movie where I say, are you not entertained? You know Russell Crowe's a Kiwi, he's not a bloody Australian. Yeah, sure. So the director's asked about what does capacity mean for who you are, where you are around the world. So I'll use my nation as an example. So we're a nation half the size of the city of New York, to try and give context, with a land mass the size of the United Kingdom, about 7,000 miles away from here, but we've got advantages in that we're 17 hours ahead of what's happening here. So when Dimitri goes back to work in another 4 hours, the intelligence brief will be delivered to the leadership in the nation at about 3 o'clock this afternoon. So not being bound by geography gives an advantage when you're thinking from an analytical point of view and an operational point of view. Then there's different training layers. How we select people in my force compared to the Australians and the Brits, the French, the Germans, they all have different training pathways and different expectations. For me to become an O5, I'd needed to have done at least one overseas course. It's mandatory to get things moving through the pathway for career development. When you start talking about capacity, the other linkages are, where I come from, our intelligence community is linked by different authorities than what you have in the US. So how I can go to our national agencies is different than what you can here, but then we can cross-deck. So the best way that I look at it, if Mr. Wiley's got, I don't know, let's say several thousand people at work, he has a broader workforce, and some of it's well ahead in time zone. And it tends to, from an analytical point of view, have a very different mindset around tradecraft. Whilst there's some foundational stuff, we do think a little bit differently around who is the decision maker, where do we get it to go to. More often than not, it's because in a small nation, you're drawn very quickly to the strategic. That's just the nature of how we do business. Is that sort of answering? Yep. Yep.
Sir, as you know, you live in a part of the world that is impacted slightly differently by the Chinese economically and other ways. I'm curious what your perspective is of the Chinese-New Zealand relationship and things to be watchful of.
Sure. So a question about the Chinese relationship with my nation. You know, I get that question a lot where I travel, so I'm not here in a New Zealand capacity, but what I will give you is personal view based on where I've been. Every time someone says to me threat, I ask, what is the opportunity? Every threat presents an opportunity, and opportunities allow options. If you go straight to threat and don't think of anything else, you bound the options for your strategic leadership. China sits as a global actor, and it sits within our part of the world. If you put New Zealand at the centre of the globe when you go, or you can do it here, you can Google it. If you put New Zealand right at the centre of the globe, all you will see is the Antarctic, that large continental ballistic protection to our left flank. And then you will see Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim nation, and then Southeast Asia and North Asia. You will not see CONUS at all. So that changes the way we view the world. This was a discussion that I would have in my previous job when someone would say, come to Washington for a meeting. Hang on, it's 5 working days out of my life to come to Washington for a 1-hour meeting. There's got to be a connection to where am I going, how am I engaging, and then what does it mean for the rest of our national interests. Small nations like mine have to trade to exist. The cultural insight, of course, is that we are New Zealanders, and we have, we're very generally quite low key. As my staff are learning, how I talk about things is fundamentally different. So I have 5 grades when I give performance reports: good, acceptable, poor, weak, fail. So no one gets good. The only people that get good are like Sir Edmund Hillary. He's a good bloke. All right? Charles Upham, VC in Bar, he was another Kiwi, he was a good soldier. He got 2 Victoria Crosses. So my staff are learning that we speak differently, and sometimes when we have those discussions around strategic resilience and strategic competition, we're not good at actually saying what it is we mean about the effect that's being created. Does that help? Yes, sir. Okay. How's my time looking? Is it 93 hours? What am I? Okay. Yes?
Sir, how is New Zealand adjusting or planning for the workforce of the future, 5th, 6th, and 7th generation?
Yep. So the beauty that we have being so small and across a whole of government approach, we have been able to drive some foundational gateway training requirements across our IC and across government. We're also, because we're not bound by US laws and federal authorities, able to look at our workforce individually and collectively through a very different lens. So for me, which shocked my executive staff when I started working, I gave them my psychological profile, which is under US law. I don't think you're allowed to pull out here's my psych assessment and this is how I receive information. As a result of that, we then layer a range of leadership development framework over defence, police and our intelligence agencies that force people to be a lot more self-reflective about the skills, habits and how they interact with people. In relation to the capabilities and platforms we bake in at the start of our acquisition system, how do we grow the people we need? And then we engage with everybody here, industry and all of the other services in other nations. For me, I did an exchange as a pathfinder with a British airborne unit when I was a young officer. So it's a cultural exchange, it's a one-for-one swap, and we do this all the time. There's value in it, but it's not easy in a bigger nation. How's that for time? Jack, you? Any more? Doug?
Probably take one more.
Can't quite see. No one wants to talk about rugby. Yes? Great, good on you, mate.
Just talking about the workforce, I've got a question more relating to the mix between military, contractor and civilian, particularly like others in Australia, trying to build technical ICT roles with uniform and
All right. Whereabouts in Australia living? Ooh, okay. All right, mate. Good on you. I really want to talk about the game on the weekend. But, yep. So inside our community at home, we've removed the word civilian in our lexicon. We have uniform, non-uniform intelligence professionals. And the change in what that meant under statute, under our authorities by which we recruit and retain, has shifted the focus of how we think about the people. It's not come without emotion. And the real challenge is how do we get into the other agencies to make that work in many respects. Blended workforces, and by blended I mean people who put their uniform on, take their uniform off based on the stage in their life. We had previous speakers talk about, or Jack was talking about, the value of people leaving an agency, going into a broader job and then coming back or adding value. Really hard when you're tying them to a mission to let them go like that, but also the value is hard to show back. Again, it's what's the risk of not doing it? But again, it is easier in a small nation to have those discussions, and in a cross-Tasman discussion, we've got trade policies that allow that to occur pretty easy. Retaining them is the question, and then giving them the opportunity to grow. Really hard. Right. I've enjoyed being out of Washington and being back in Tampa. I've enjoyed seeing some friends that I haven't seen for a while. And again, I want to thank you for what you do leading coalitions. We're not good at that sometimes, so thank you very much. I look forward to hanging around for the rest of the day. I'll be able to take other questions. Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you, General Howard. He mentioned a couple things that really resonated with me, and we've seen this as a theme throughout the discussions this morning. General Howard mentioned trust, people, data. He also talked about risk, which is defined by complexity. And in basic terms, complexity is defined by the number of interfaces. If you look at whether it's social, socio-technical, or technical systems, our success is based on the efficiency of our interfaces, the very message that General Howard was carrying forward. As General Ashley said earlier in his opening remarks, we can't win the next war alone. It really depends on the efficiency of those interfaces. I asked our MC who did this last year, how should I introduce folks? What should I say? And he told me, ask them an interesting fact, about themselves that you could share. So I asked General Howard, what's an interesting fact about yourself? And he responded with nothing. So I pried a little harder and I said, well, there's got to be something interesting about you. And he said, my uniform's different. So I'm going to go ahead and declare that approach a failure. So, as opposed to stating the obvious. So I'll jump right into the introduction of our next speaker, Vice Admiral Matthew Kohler, the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for the Information Warfare Director of Naval Intelligence. In June 2018, Admiral Kohler assumed the duties as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare and the 67th Director of Naval Intelligence. Early in his career as an intelligence officer, he deployed worldwide supporting combat operations in numerous aircraft, carrier strike groups, and amphibious groups. He has served in fleet, interagency, combatant command leadership positions, and as an information warfare officer. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Kohler. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. All right, can you hear me? I need to adjust the microphone for the mutant size here, away from the fun size podium work here. Hey, it's great to be here. I appreciate the time. Those are great words from General Howard. Thank you. Since he took extra time, I consider that my time sharing with you as a partner the last 10 minutes. But mindful that I am in a pole position keeping you all from lunch, I will try and keep on target here, so thanks very much. Speaking about lunch, I like the theme that we started with this morning, which was beer and pizza. I couldn't agree more, so let me stretch that analogy with our information domain. Yes, beer and pizza, though I'm more of a bourbon fan. A lot of beer and pizza. And I want it delivered to my doorstep. And I want it to be fresh and hot, so it needs to be fast, delivered to the front. And it may be delivered in a neighborhood that's not so great. And so I need it still delivered in that capacity. And finally, it darn well better taste good for joint and for our partners. So I'm going to keep on with this beer and pizza thing until everybody gets hungry and just picks up and leave. So, by the way, General, nobody pushed me down at a family picnic. Though I did grow up with 3 older sisters, so I grew up tough in a completely different way. Hey, one thing I'd want to share, I'm going to talk a couple different themes, and it almost was like General Howard and I compared notes ahead of time in terms of how we consider our business, data warriors, that kind of aspect of how we approach the kind of challenges we're facing today. And I'll try and carry that theme here through some of my remarks. I just finished last week, Thursday and Friday, I went to the Navy's Recruit Training Center up at Great Lakes, which is just north of Chicago on Lake Michigan. Beautiful place in the summer. I deliberately decided not to go there in January because it would be a completely different experience. It was a great experience. You know, we talk a lot about working with our young people and organizations, but that was just an absolutely energizing experience for me. We graduated on Friday, the Navy's newest 1,030 sailors. By the way, 3,000 family members were in the audience for that. The #1 graduate was an IT, information technology. It just kind of shows the type of talent we're bringing out. I met with that young sailor, and we just can't get those folks to the fleet fast enough. I should say I am here for CNO Richardson. I think he very much, he's a huge believer in the challenges we're facing in the information domain. He did very much want to be here and to address this audience. He is in his literally last days of his tenure as a CNO. He will turn over on Thursday to Admiral Mike Gilday, is our next Chief of Naval Operations. For those who don't know Mike Gilday, he is certainly a warrior and pulled deep from our 3-star ranks to rise to the top of our Navy here on Thursday. He also is our most practiced and steeped CNO in the tradecraft of our business. He was the Director of Operations at J3 for Cybercom. He was also the Director of Fleet Cyber Command, 10th Fleet. I think that speaks, one, to the kind of demand signal I'm going to get personally in my business, starting Thursday, but it also speaks to the kind of skill sets that our senior leaders are being expected to perform, and at least say how the Navy is thinking and moving ahead. For my comments, I'll talk a couple different things. Thanks for the introduction. Where are you, Doug? By the way, I can come up with all kinds of different spins on your experience in the 90s with your experience. Mine was a decade earlier, working with PCs that were luggables, 35 pounds, trying to develop those kind of capabilities. But I'll talk about a little bit about some of my positions because it talks about how the Navy has organized around this challenge of what we call information warfare. So I was introduced as a Deputy Chief Naval Operations for Information Warfare. My staff code is an N2N6. It is the Navy's effort 10 years ago of combining all of our information-based capabilities into one directorate, moving away from, it was an attempt to move away from a platform focus 10 years ago into an information-based type of construct. So I have all the programs that related to intelligence, to communications, to our cryptologic warfare, SIGINT, EW, and cyber capabilities, as well as our meteorology, oceanographic, and our space capabilities. And so I have about 200 programs with about a $9 billion budget, bringing that together to drive change. I'm also the Director of Naval Intelligence that drives the MIP type of parts of the budget, co-aligned with the other programs that we have, and focused on driving a deep penetrating knowledge of our adversary, not just how they operate in the kinetic domain, but how our adversaries are moving in and about information space and driving that capacity. By the way, in that capacity, I report to the Office of Director of National Intelligence. That was Director Coates, now Acting Director McGuire. So I'm referred to as the little DNI, the Director of Naval Intelligence, not to confuse with the Director of National Intelligence. So I've told Director Coates and then recently Acting Director McGuire that I consider myself the big little DNI. It seems to play so far. I haven't been fired. I'm also the Deputy Department of Navy CIO, the Chief Information Officer. So I'm responsible for all the policies as well as a whole tranche of the cybersecurity responsibilities that go with it. I'll talk a little bit more here in a bit about where the Navy is going with its DON CIO position. Finally, I'm the Information Warfare Community Lead that have brought all of the, under its umbrella, the capabilities, information-based capabilities that align with the programs I talked about earlier. It's all of our intelligence personnel. It is all of our cryptologic warfare folks, our cyber, EW folks. It's our IPs that run and operate our networks and our communications, our meteorology, oceanographic personnel, and space cadre. 52,000 altogether. That includes our active duty military, our reserve military, and our civilians, responsible for how that, that entire community is oriented. Along with that, we stood up several organizations. 10 years ago, we stood up our Fleet Cyber Command 10th Fleet. That was ultimately the maritime component of Cyber Command. And then we also stood up Navy Information Forces, which was dedicated for the express purpose of ensuring that all of the information warfare capability that we put afloat, as well as what we put ashore, all of our comm centers, our SIGINT centers, our intel centers, to ensure that they were ready to fight. That's a construct. Navy calls it a type command. We have type commands. I've had them for 70 years for our aviation community, for our surface community, our sub community. And it was the Navy that recognized that information warfare was so important, they stood up that organization for just that purpose. We stood up our own Top Gun, if you will, our Navy Information Warfighting Development Center for information warfare that's focused on advanced IW training. It's focused on developing and deploying advanced tactics, techniques, and procedures. We established that 2 years ago, just like the other warfighting areas that are established, and are taking our construct down to our very tactical warfighting areas in terms of how we apply this type of construct. We've established, almost 3 years ago now, an information warfare commander in each of our carrier strike groups. Navy has had a long tradition of establishing warfare commanders in the air, sea, subsurface domain in terms of how they operate in a very complex and dynamic warfight at sea. It's recognizing the challenges that we face in the information domain are so complex at the tactical and operational level that we've established those relationships. It's a construct we think has been successful. It's not perfect, but we're definitely on the right cardinal heading, and we continue to adapt as we move along. We have delivered now with this construct. We celebrate our 10th year anniversary here in October. It's grown, for an example of the success, we've grown to over 19 flag officers. 5 of them are 3 stars, and we think it's developing the kind of skill sets that we need. I would also say that we're seeing the kind of other partners, our services, as well as our international partners, also grappling with how they organize around this concept. We've seen the Marine Corps and now recently the Air Force have stood up their equivalent on their staffs with a A2, A6-like organization. And a lot of our international partners have oriented themselves around this as well. We're working very closely with our Five Eye partners as they approach their constructs to this. Our UK partners, for example, have organized their new carrier strike group and new joint strike fighter around this information warfare construct, as well as other partners that we have, like the Japanese and others that we're sharing. We have with our NIWITIC, our Top Gun organization, have shared our TTP on our information warfare commander construct with all of our partners. It's a hungry and growing business. I want to touch on a couple of pieces here before I open up for questions. There's a number of things that are driving us. I could talk about great power competition. It's almost become a bumper sticker for everyone in terms of how we're moving ahead, but it clearly is driving everything that we're doing inside the Navy in terms of how we're approaching this one. And when I say Navy, it means everything's how we're driving with us, that drives our business with our joint partners and with our international partners. A key construct is what we call dynamic maritime operations, that is based on a construct that says the warfighting construct challenge has gotten so complex in the maritime domain that we are no longer focused just on tactical warfighting that we see ahead of us, which is focused on our carrier strike groups and expeditionary strike groups, but envision multiple carrier strike groups that will be operated from a fleet position. That requires the kind of maneuver that requires our units to operate over very wide geographic spaces, but ability to operate in a distributed way, but focused and delivering effects at the right time and tempo. To be able to do that requires everything that information warfare must deliver. That requires the type of networking capability that delivers exquisite information at the right time, at the right place, in a comms contested environment. We're given explicit direction in our Maritime Design 2.0 to develop this, what we call a Navy tactical grid that's designed to enable this DMO construct. To be fair, we have a Navy tactical grid today. It just needs to be consistent with this conference of more resilient, redundant, and survivable type of construct, and that's where we're moving ahead. We define it as Navy tactical grid, but it is also the Naval tactical grid with our Marine partners, and it is absolutely the joint tactical grid that we signed an MOU with our partners in terms of how we move ahead. That includes our international partners. But it is actually, we consider it essential to how we will be successful in the future. The cloud, lots of discussions about the cloud. Without a doubt, like the other services, the Navy is all in on the cloud. We signed a cloud-first policy out 2 years ago and readjusted it just several months ago. We have moved over 50 programs into the cloud. We have another 100 waiting to move into the cloud on their path. And we're looking at every program that we have that I'm responsible for, as well as across the Navy, in terms of moving the programs where they make sense and move them into the cloud in a rapid way. We are definitely on board with the need, as General Assey highlighted, with where DoD CIO DC is going with the JEDI cloud. We need the capability that JEDI intends to deliver to allow that cross-domain enterprise cloud that allows us to deliver data and, just as importantly, applications in a much more rapid method, potentially into a disconnected or comms contested environment. So we remain all in on the cloud and where we're going with it. I was pleased to see General Assey's comments earlier also about the C2 of JWICS. JWICS says C2. We're also completely on board with that. We actually established a program office, PMW 260, several months ago to get after that, to increase the capability and the resilience and straight capacity of our JWICS capability, because we anticipate that will be an increasing demand signal for us, and it's something that we are definitely on the road to pursue. Finally, I'll make some comments here and open up for any questions on remarks on how the Navy is reorganizing around its CIO position. For those that might have been paying attention to some recent roundtables by our Undersecretary Thomas Modly, announced late last week that they were establishing a Department of Navy CIO position. I should say reestablishing that it exists in different forms in the past, but it's not going to be your grandfather's DON CIO position. Currently, there is a DON CIO, that is Undersecretary Modly. My counterpart, Lieutenant General Lori Reynolds, is the Marine Corps Deputy DON CIO. I'm also the Deputy DON CIO in that capacity. They're talking about establishing this position as a special assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, for information management and the Chief Information Office position. It will be, again, much more strategic than what has been in the past. I think it was a recognition that came out of the SecNav-directed cybersecurity readiness review last year. It was the Navy directing a study to look at ourselves in terms of how well we were doing in cybersecurity. The report was pretty much left no prisoners in terms of how we were doing, and key was work at the governance level that ultimately directed and is impetus behind this change. Clearly, this challenge has gotten so great that Undersecretary Modly will be moving one of his hats as the DON CIO to a full-time position, but it'll be more than just moving the hat. It's going to include several other capabilities within it that includes a chief data officer, a chief technology officer, a CISO type of functions that require a focused effort. The way this has continued to be envisioned, it's still an item in work. We're just being about as transparent as we can in terms of what this will look like. This construct is envisioned to include my position as well as Lieutenant General Reynolds as the Deputy DON CIO to continue as well in that supporting role. So we'll continue to move out in those areas. Those are the thrust of my comments today. I was really hoping to open up and leave open for questions to be relevant here to the audience. So with that, I will hold and take any questions from the audience that you may have. Thank you. I think for everyone here, the question was acknowledging that we're an unclassified venue, describing the information warfare environment that we are experiencing in the Gulf. I would say my comments would be agnostic of where we are geographically. Where we're deploying each area, it brings its own challenges. Some of it's just self-induced in terms of capacity that we have. For example, our great power competition, in some ways it's not going backwards, but some ways it feels like that. It requires us to operate in areas that we have not done in quite some time. For example, we took the Harry S. Truman Strike Group up into the high north. The first time we've had a carrier strike group up there intended to get closer up into the Russians' backyard. That's the first time we've had a carrier strike up there in 15 years. A whole different relearning of the type of communications support environment that we found ourselves in, as well as just a raft of other logistics challenges that we find ourselves in. So we're finding this great power competition taking us into areas that we have not, I'll say maybe been used to in the past, but it's not the same as it was before. It's much more challenging. We're finding any actors in areas that we routinely operate in, like the Gulf, are just making us do push-ups harder in terms of how we're operating. We have found that for us to be able to operate effectively in those areas, the the establishment of our information warfare commander construct has proven to be hugely successful. The carrier strike group commanders and the other warfare commanders have been singing its praises because we require that agility across all of those information-based domains. It needed an expert to run at that level. So I guess in discussing this 10-year history that I shared with you briefly, my thoughts go back to the founding fathers in that business. So it was the late 2000s when the discussion started about how the challenges that we're going to face and how do we need to start posturing to meet it. Back during that time, we were nostril deep in the counter-terror land-focused fight, rightfully so, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there were a couple of folks, Encino Roughhead, Vice Admiral Jack Dorsett, Admiral Harry Harris, who was the OpNev N6 at the time, and said, yeah, we're recognizing that the fight has shifted, even the CT fight, about how information-focused it was. And so they started talking about how we need to organize ourselves differently. If we had not started thinking that way and made changes, at least on the Navy naval side of the house, we could not deliver an information warfare commander the way we did to be able to meet inside that environment. Which I'm grateful for, is I've got a chance to continue to accelerate. My thoughts are, what should we be thinking now? The challenges that we continue to face, General Howard talked about it. What does the data warrior look like in 2025 or beyond? What are we creating here in terms of, are we organizing ourselves right? If we're not organized right, we're never going to get there right. And so the governance pieces, how we're structured and organized are completely critical in this piece. Navy certainly is looking how we define warriors. We use the term. I think most of us in this business would agree that we are in a day-to-day contact with our adversaries that we would call a warfighting construct. The Navy's looking to actually define that more officially and taking our information warfare-based capability, our information warfare community, and officially moving it into what Navy would call a line community, recognizing its warfighting requirement. That, no kidding, is something in law. I'm mindful of our partners on the Hill here. This is not predisposing any decisions that will be made there, but this is where the Navy is going in terms of how we are orienting ourselves, talking with our feet. When we mean warriors, data warriors, information warriors, we're talking about continuing to move with our feet. That DMO construct I talked about, which means where Navy is thinking about operating at an operational scale, think multiple carrier strike groups, something we really haven't done since really World War II, because that's the complexity that we think we're involved in. Is also the discussion is, okay, we've organized ourselves at the tactical level or in information warfare. What does that look like at the operational level? So we're continuing to look ahead in terms of how we're organizing ourselves and as well as providing those key capabilities of equipping the woman, equipping the man in terms of how we do our business.
Along those lines, the Navy's had a long history of service in space. Can you comment a little bit on your vision for the Navy space cadre as things evolve with Space Force and other matters?
Sure. Clearly, Navy is a huge consumer of what space provides across information warfare, from our communications to our intelligence functions, and will continue to be so. The Navy has, what we have in terms of our personnel, a space cadre capability, and we've taken a hard look about how we have looked at coding our billets across our enterprise. Again, with this change and shift to an operational level construct, do we have the right space experts at the right places, at the strike groups, at our numbered fleets, other areas? And we did that about 2.5 years ago in terms of, do we have that right? And the answer, we didn't, and we're making adjustments, and we're looking to expand that space cadre construct. Having said that, we're not operating alone. We're operating in certainly where the river is moving towards Space Command, Space Force, and the Navy is fully on board with where that's going. The Navy will remain fully committed to running those tasks that we are given to operate within space domain our narrowband communications and others that we're primarily given responsibility for. But we are very much in discussions with where Space Com is going and where Space Force is going, and that's our future in terms of how we align ourselves. But the key pieces as we go forward is to ensure that not just the Navy, but all the services through these construct changes continues to get the kind of support we need out of our space-based capabilities. One more question?
Admiral, 3 weeks ago, Aerospace released a paper that talked about entering the era of ubiquitous, continuous ISR. I'm curious about your thoughts on, one, the reality of that, two, the impact of that, both on operations and ultimately the practice.
Yes, sir. I recognize the voice. That's got to be Joe Mazafro. Excellent. Yes, I did see that article you're referring to. It just highlights the challenges that we face in the information space. It's getting harder and harder. Those challenges that you highlight are a growing fact of life that affects the joint force. It affects how we're operating with our partners. And we're just going to have to figure how we get to operate in a much more dynamic and agile way than we even think we have to operate now. That bar in terms of how we operate in a maritime domain, in terms of being able to detect the enemy before they can detect us, remaining untargeted, that bar continues to be raised with an increasingly challenged ISR environment. I think we have built within the construct the flexibility to continue to adapt. We built an organization that will, with our NIWITIC, that will allow us to develop new TTPs in terms of how we do this. We have our work cut out for us. All of us do across the joint force in that area. All right, I thank you very much for your time, and I commend you to your work over the next 2 days, and I hope to see some of you in some of those discussions. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Admiral Kohler. Thank you for attending DoDIIS, and thank you for your remarks. We're now going to break for lunch until 1 o'clock, and the breakout sessions will start promptly thereafter. Also, the exhibit hall is open for anyone that would like to attend during the lunch break if you're not hungry. And please be here tomorrow at 7:50, where we'll open with our ICCIO, John Sherman. Thank you.